Hello, I'm Darkwell, Bled, and welcome to Beyond the Rusted Gate, bringing you spooky stories by me every fortnight. Today's story, Noisy Neighbours. Brandon had been sitting at his desk for hours. The room was stale air, the only light admitted from a small, overtaxed orange globe that had begun to double as a heat source. The windows were closed and the blinds were drawn. He could not allow himself to be distracted by the city below. Tomorrow, Brandon would have to submit a paper whose success or failure would determine whether or not his future in academia would continue. His essay, was due in the morning. Brandon had only barely begun to write. His entire future was reliant on this paper, an essay that currently amounted to nothing more than a blank page. Everything, his future career, his future life, was dependent on his ability to think clearly, to rationalize, to concentrate and to craft an argument that a third-party observer would determine was sound and logical. It all hinged on tonight and whether or not Brandon would be able to avoid procrastination, remain disciplined and undistracted, and manage to maintain his focus. Yet, while all hung on such a delicate threshold, Mr. Murphy, Brandon's upstairs neighbor, stomped and romped with unrestrained discourtesy. He sounded as if he were marching, back and forth as though he were participating in some absurd military display. Thump, thump, thump. He, Mr. Murphy, seemed like he was a military man, ex-military, that is. An aged soldier, once a general, maybe. Brandon had, in fact, never seen his upstairs neighbor, and only knew his name from the mail slots in the foyer. Even so, he could well imagine that this was exactly how he looked. He, as he stomped, would be dressed in his ill-fitting general's outfit that had once made him look smart, the kind you saw in those old World War II movies. He was almost certainly wearing his old military boots. They were knee-high, black, and very heavy. Thump, thump, thump. This was absurd. Brandon kneaded his fist into his forehead and tried to concentrate. Tomorrow would decide all. He needed to concentrate. The essay requirements were simple enough. Here is your arbitrarily assigned topic. Are you for it or against it? Defend your position. But now, as he put pen to paper, he found he couldn't quite remember his position, or if he was for it or against it, or what the topic was to begin with, and above him Mr. Murphy continued his sick cruelties. Thump, bang, groan, whimper. It was a pitiful whimper. Mr. Murphy sounded as though he had stumbled, fallen over, hurt himself, and was now injured. He was no doubt drunk again. Brandon was sure of that. Brandon was certain that Mr. Murphy was an alcoholic of the worst order, always on the sauce. Or perhaps he had thrown something at his dog again, and now the poor creature, with its misplaced loyalties, was prostrating itself pathetically in the corner. Pets weren't even allowed in the apartment block, and Brandon had never seen one there, but Mr. Murphy was the kind of person to blatantly ignore such rules, Brandon was sure. The whimpering and the groaning merged into one and sounded more desperate and pained, and Brandon was convinced that Mr. Murphy was watching some kind of sick porn, some kind of torture porn with chains and kidnapping and unwilling participants, watched at such a high volume, not despite the fact that his neighbors might hear, but specifically because they could and would, and because that's exactly the kind of sick thing Mr. Murphy really gets off on. Brandon reread the question for the 5th time. He got out the dictionary and looked up each of the words that made up the sentence to make certain he fully understood them. Of course he did. He hadn't neglected his classes. Individually their meanings were perfectly plain, but when assembled in order they became jumbled and convoluted. No doubt it would make perfect sense with a clear head. With a clear head he would read it all and think how it was all so obvious. It would be so much easier with a clear head if he could just concentrate. It would be so much easier if Mr. Murphy could just stop... What? Rapping? It sounded as though he were rapping his fingers on the floor, as if he were impatiently awaiting something. Brandon's essay, maybe. Perhaps Mr. Murphy was somehow aware of the essay and Brandon's struggle and had chosen to mock him cruelly by rapping his fingers on the floor impatiently. Rapping them just so Brandon would have to hear them rap and feel the time tick by as they did. Ticking down to the deadline in the morning that would decide Brandon's fate. Or was he tapping his foot softly but incredibly fast? Or rapping and tapping all at once in order to somehow overlap the sounds that blurred into one another and became one and the same and yet infinitely distinct? It was white noise, static, endlessly bouncing back and forth, specifically manufactured for the purpose of distracting Brandon's synapses from firing. It was... vacuuming? Maybe? It was hard to tell as the noise was so constant yet so varied, and yet Brandon was sure a vacuum it must be. Mr. Murphy was some kind of hypochondriac neurotic, vacuuming at 3 in the morning with no consideration for others and their schedules. All Mr. Murphy could think of were dust mites and microscopic germs, but not people. The essay had still not been begun, and with increasing certainty, Brandon was becoming sure its topic had never been covered in class, and yet its subject was clearly penned in his lecture notes, but he could not remember it, or the context of his notes, or how they related to the question, and yet he was sure he could figure it all out if Mr. Murphy would just shut off his damn TV. Yes, surely that's what it was, a TV. Mr. Murphy was doubtlessly an old man. He had Alzheimer's and narcolepsy and a bad hip. He had fallen asleep in front of the television, and the channel had ended for the evening and it had gone to static. Not vacuuming, nor rapping or tapping, but static. Signal lost. Well, that wasn't good enough. Mr. Murphy knew he was working on an essay. How couldn't he? Why would he be making such noise if not for knowing and wantonly being cruel? Brandon's essay was due in the morning, and his future depended on his concentration, and his concentration demanded no distractions, and that required silence. Brandon could stand no more. Through the closed blinds, the sun was shining and the city below was waking, and Mr. Murphy's inconsiderate cruelty still wouldn't cease. So what if he were an old man, senile and fragile, or a perverted woman-hating, dog-kicking sleaze to be avoided, or a veteran of World War II who fought the Nazis and deserved respect? Brandon was in the now, and whatever it was that Mr. Murphy was, Brandon needed silence, and Mr. Murphy was refusing to let up with his incessant noise. Brandon grabbed a broom from his kitchenette and began banging on the ceiling above his desk. He banged, he thudded, and he began to yell. "Hey, old man! Hey, General! Listen here, you neurotic, hypochondriac, sexual pervert!" He slammed and he banged the broom head into the ceiling, and the dust and paint and plaster rained down onto Brandon's desk and his unfinished yet begun paper. "Stop your rapping and your tapping and your stomping and your vacuuming! Turn off your damn TV, and don't you know there's no pets allowed?" He cried and he hammered and he pounded, and the tapping and the rapping became a thunderous downpour, and the pathetic whimper became squeals and screams, and then finally, the crack. The ceiling that was Mr. Murphy's floor gave way, and down onto Brandon's desk flowed a cascade of fattened, well-fed rats that tapped and rapped and squealed and screamed, and with them slushed and rattled and sludged down onto Brandon's unstarted paper the few unfinished scraps and the gnawed bones that were once Mr. Murphy. Thanks for listening. That was Noisy Neighbours from my second collection of short stories, Screams from Beyond the Crypt. If you would like to own it in paperback form, it is available from most online book retailers. Until next fortnight, I am Darkwell Bled. Stay spooky.